Everyone. Thanks, CN. My name's Avi Rose. I'm Ashby Village's acting executive director this summer while Andy Gaines takes a leave. I am glad for this opportunity to do the initial introduction for Martin Hellman's presentation called Nuclear Threat or Nuclear Opportunity. This program is being presented as part of the Ashby Village's Arts and Culture series, and it's being presented by the Village's Science and Ideas group. Some of you may be longtime Ashby Village members, some of you may be new, but just to quickly say that Ashby Village is a membership organization of East Bay older adults joining together to build community and support each other as we're aging. There are a wide variety of programs and services and interest groups and many other things. If you are interested in learning more about Ashby Village and becoming a member or a volunteer or a donor or maybe even all three, I invite you to join the next living room chat taking place on Tuesday, August 3rd from 2 to 3 p.m. This will be virtual, and Suyen just put a link into the chat box. I encourage you to come if you want to learn more about the village. I also, for those of you who are already members and volunteers, I invite you to an in-person social hour, the first in a long time, coming up on Friday, August 20th from 4 to 5 p.m. And I believe that Suyen might be linking that as well. And my third invitation is to invite you to consider donating to Ashby Village to enable us to continue to provide the kind of excellent programs that you're going to participate in today. So all that being said, I want to turn it over to Joe Evinger, who's chair of Ashby Village's Science and Ideas Group.
Welcome to the Ashby Village Science and Ideas Group presentation. My name's Joe Evinger, and I help coordinate this group's events. Our group was founded in 2017, roughly. Our members are all members of Ashby Village, various educational work background, but we share one thing in common, and that is science and ideas. We are about 36 of us members so far. We meet on the second Tuesday of every month from 3 o'clock until 4:30. We have a different guest speaker each month who speaks on a topic related to science and ideas. We rely on our science group members, the Arts and Culture Committee, and Ashby Village members for ideas about new speakers and ways to connect with them. I'd like to give special thanks to Julie and Marcia and Suyen and everybody else who's worked so hard on putting this presentation together. Normally, there are about just a couple of dozen of us watching a presentation, so this is big time for us under the auspices there of Julie and Marcia. Over the past years, our group has enjoyed a number of presentations. Let me give you just a little taste. We talked about the internet and its effect on our attention spans. We had someone come and talk to us about what lies beneath the surface of Lake Merritt, a local lake here in Oakland. We had an astronomer come talk to us about asteroids and meteors and the possibility of one of them hitting Earth. We've heard about plate tectonics that would be of some interest here in Northern California. We've heard about alternative energy sources. We've had several epidemiologists come and talk to us about you know what. And we've heard about some of the earliest human migrations out of Africa. We invite all Ashby Village members to join our group. Anybody else interested in coming to one of our presentations is most welcome. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Marcia Freeman, who among her many, many other activities, I could go on, is on the Ashby Village Steering Committee for the Arts and Culture Series. She coordinates the Speakers Bureau for the outreach team. And Marcia, you have the floor, or should I say, the Zoom screen.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. The Arts and Culture Group has been putting on events like this 4 to 5 times each year for the past 5 years. We are all members of the village and/or volunteers, and this is an entirely a volunteer activity that we all love very much because we get to bring to you some of the leading lights in our own community as well as in the Greater Bay Area. And through Zoom, we've even been able to do greater outreach than that. I want to quickly just tell you about the upcoming Arts and Culture event, which is going to be in October. And we are co-sponsoring with JSEI, which is a Japanese American Community Care and Cultural Organization. We're featuring the art of Chiura Obata, who is a leading figure in Northern California arts community and a founder of schools of art within the internment camp during the Japanese internment of World War II. His work will be highlighted and his life story is going to be told by his granddaughter, Kimi Kodani Hill, who is the editor of the book Topaz Moon, Chiura Obata's Art of the Internment. I would also just say that Obata's work has been featured at the Smithsonian Museum of American Art very recently in a major presentation. And I think this is going to be one of our most exciting arts and culture events. I would like to now introduce to you the person who is going to be introducing our featured speaker, and that is Julie Freestone, who is a member of our board of directors. And among other things, she is co-chair of the communications committee of the board, as well as on the steering committee of Elder Action, which is a group that I'm involved with as well. And we are a social justice interest group within Ashby Village. Together with her husband, Rudy Robb, she is the author of Stumbling Stone, an autobiographical novel based on their joint exploration of Robb's German family during the Nazi era. Julie is an old friend of Marty Hellman's, whom she met when they were teenagers attending prestigious Bronx High School of Science, which I've always admired enormously. The best of the best come out of that high school. So, Julie.
Well, you stole the beginning of my introduction. Okay, well, I'm really delighted to introduce Marty. I have known him for 60 years. I counted it up. It's remarkable to me that it could have been that long. So I got out my yearbook, there it is, and I discovered that he had actually signed my yearbook in a very, very appropriate grown-up way, nothing weird. Good luck and best wishes. So that was sort of exciting to discover. So we reconnected within probably the last 20 years or so. And that was a very happy reconnection for my husband, who was a glider pilot, and discovered that Marty was also a glider pilot. And they spent a decade flying over the Sierras and other places together. So I am going to now begin the formal introduction of Marty. So Professor Martin Hellman is an adjunct senior fellow for nuclear risk analysis at the Federation of American Scientists. He is also professor of electrical engineering at Stanford University and is affiliated with its Center for International Security and Cooperation. His many honors include membership in the U.S. National Academy of Engineering, and this is a biggie, I think, winning the multi-million-dollar ACM Turing Award, the top prize in computer science. So you all actually know Marty. He may not look familiar to you, but he is seen as the father of public key cryptography for having invented, along with Whitfield Diffie and Ralph Merkle, the technology that protects monetary transactions on the internet every day. And I'm sure none of us do any internet transactions. So the invention protects trillions of dollars a day. So not long after giving the world public key cryptography, Marty switched his focus from encryption to efforts that might avoid nuclear war. And he says he had this conversation with himself in which he said, well, what is the point of developing new algorithms if nobody is going to be around in 50 to 100 years to deal with them? So he did not then envision that cybersecurity would also become an existential threat involving a series of actions and reactions that could lead to nuclear war, an escalation similar to what couples often get into. And I mention that because it's relevant to Marty. Here is where the professional and the personal converge. So about 1980, Marty slowly, and he says painfully, came to see that his overfocus on career and logic was killing his marriage. So, as he explained with the book that he wrote, I have all my props here, you can see. This is the book that he and his wife Dorothy wrote together. It's called A New Map for Relationships, Creating True Love at Home and Peace on the Planet. Isn't that a nice thought? Anyway, he said that, he explains this in the book, that he realized that it wasn't smart to neglect risks either in marriage or to the planet. And there is a surprising connection between the two. The book is very instructive and entertaining as well. So Marty shifted his research from information security to international security with a focus on the risk of nuclear deterrence failing and the risk of nuclear war. So almost as soon as he took a look at that question with new eyes, he saw that the risk of nuclear devastation was unacceptably high. So he has continued to develop that line of thinking and is going to talk to us today about his current perspective, his current project, and at least one way that we can help. So, Marty, it's all yours.
Thank you, Julie. Great to see you again, and thanks for that introduction. So, and thank you, Ashby Village, for hosting us, all the people involved in making this happen. Oh, I want to start my stopwatch so I can stay in the time. The title of the talk, as Avi said, is Nuclear Threat or Nuclear Opportunity. And how could something as horrific as the threat of nuclear war also be an opportunity? Well, Julie kind of got to it in her introduction. Can the threat of divorce be an opportunity? 40 years ago, Dorothy, my wife, was ready to leave me, but I didn't know it. I had blinders on. I was too busy, all the normal things. I was ready to be blindsided the way many husbands are. Everything was going great, and then my wife left me. I had no idea what happened. But fortunately, Dorothy came to this conclusion. What she said is, if it had been bearable, I might have put up with it, meaning our marriage. But because it was unbearable, I was going to get it right. She had no idea how she was going to get it right because she'd never seen a marriage like she wanted. We haven't had a fight in almost 20 years, and we disagree. We talk. It's not like we, live in separate parts of the house. And if she told me that's what she was working on, I would have just chalked it up to ridiculous dreaming on the part of this crazy woman, which is how I saw her at the time. She had no idea how she was going to do that, but she was determined, and she found a way. In fact, in one of the talks we did together, she found this wonderful Mark Twain quote: "They didn't know it was impossible, so they did it." And in this case, the they really is Dorothy, because she dragged me, as Julie pointed out, almost kicking and screaming through the process, for which I'm now grateful. Disagreements, we still have disagreements, but they've become learning opportunities. And if there's time, I'll have one example later. And one thing that to relate it to both the international and the interpersonal is a little card Dorothy put on the back of our bedroom door for many years. Do you just want to be right, or do you want to be happy? And those were the choices we had. And it turns out, if you want to be right, then you also have to be happy, because as long as I was focused on my piece of the truth, I wasn't right. Now, all of this applies internationally as well as interpersonally. And one thing I'll add to what Julie said about our book is we made a PDF of the entire book freely available on the internet, including on my Stanford homepage. And I suspect Su Yin can put that in the chat, or if anybody needs it, you can contact someone at Ashby Village and they can get it to you. And so taking Mark Twain's comment and or quote and turning it over to the international, they didn't know world peace was impossible, so they did it. This is something I hope generations looking back 50 years in the future will be able to say. And by the way, I don't think they'll necessarily see it as world peace, just as we slavery ended in this country legally with an amendment to the Constitution. And yet there still are forms of slavery that go on today. And many people, particularly since this is an East Bay group centered on the People's Republic of Berkeley, as I understand it, that many people would still say that we still have slavery, and they're right. And in the same way, I don't think we'll see that people 50 years from now would see it as world peace, but from our current perspective, we would. And by the way, one very hopeful sign, I don't know how many people know it, but peace came to the Western Hemisphere in 2015. In some sense, half the world came to be at peace. I haven't checked to make sure that the war in Colombia, which was the last official war between the rebels, FARC, and the government, is now officially over, because there were some rumblings. But that was amazing. That was unbelievable if you think back to the 80s and El Salvador and Nicaragua and all those things. It doesn't mean that there isn't some conflict, but there's not a legal, there's not something that the appropriate group calls war. Well, coming back, I had to face the abyss of divorce, the risk of losing my family before I would change. What is the international equivalent? Because I think it does take a forcing function for people to change that much. The international equivalent is nuclear war. And so let me read the abstract for this talk. The Manhattan Project transformed ethical decision-making from a moral concern into one that is essential for the survival of civilization. Yet society's thinking is mired in pre-nuclear models of national security. What do I mean by that? We still think we need thousands of nuclear weapons to be comparable to the Russians, to be equal. The Chinese don't view it that way. They have what they call a minimal deterrent, just a couple of hundred nuclear weapons. Now, they may be in the process of expanding, and if so, it may be due to insanity on their part, matching our insanity, or it may be that they've concluded that we think that unless you have thousands of weapons, you're not a world power. And the abstract there goes on. This talk addresses how to correct that imbalance and the role that you as an individual can play in transforming existential threats into unprecedented opportunities. So in thinking about this talk, I came up with 3 key steps. Step 1, recognize that the risk of a major nuclear war is far greater than most people realize. Step 2, believe that a solution is possible. And that's not as easy as it sounds, because it looks impossible from our current perspective. And the third step is to see the role that you can play and act accordingly, because societal change occurs through individual change. Well, let's talk about the first step, the recognizing that the risk of a major nuclear war is far greater than people realize. And I'm going to go to share screen, and I'm going to show you. Can you see that? Just give me a thumbs up, Julie, if you can. Okay, good. This is, I call the man in the TNT vest. Imagine a guy wearing a TNT vest were to come into the room where you're sitting now and sit down next to you. You would get out of there as fast as you could, even if he explained to you, hey, I'm not a suicide bomber. I don't have the buttons for setting off this explosive vest. There's a button in Washington, which was with President Trump, a nice, cautious man for the last 4 years. And now it's with Biden. You can surely trust him. And there's one in Moscow with Putin, again, a cautious person. So just relax and enjoy the webinar. You would still get out of that room as fast as you could. And so why, just because we can't see the weapons controlled by those buttons, why have we sat here as a society complacently assuming that because the Earth's explosive vest has not yet gone off, it never will? As if confronted by that man in the TNT vest, we need to be plotting an escape route. There should be, I made a link available to a recent article that I had with Vint Cerf, who some of you may recognize. Vint is one of the 2 true fathers of the internet. He's Google's chief internet evangelist. This was in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. And my article explains why the risk of a major nuclear war is on the order of 1% per year. That has a special meaning in science and technology that I won't go into here. But I guess it means, Julie may remember this, even though she says she didn't like the science part. It means it's not exactly 1%. It could be 2%, maybe even 3%, a 0.5%, maybe even 1/3%. but it's not 10% a year, and it's not 0.1% per year. Let's, for the moment, let's forget the math and just assume that it is 1% a year. If so, we are playing a game that I call nuclear roulette. It's a global version of Russian roulette, once every 15 years, roughly. So over the lifetime of a child born today, roughly 80 or 90 years, we're not playing Russian roulette with that child's life just once, or nuclear roulette with society's life. We're not just playing it once, we're playing it about 5 or 6 times. This is a horrendous risk. Now, the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, which all of you except for Su Yin are old enough to remember, is the closest that the world ever came to a nuclear war. And there were several risks during that crisis that even Kennedy did not know about. Khrushchev did, which is one of the reasons he may have capitulated. American destroyers intercepted 3 Soviet submarines near Cuba and attacked them, forced them to surface by dropping what they call practice nuclear depth charges. They're supposed to be like small hand grenades that don't do any harm. Well, one of the crew members, 40 years later in 2002 in Russia, put out a book that said, they didn't see my practice nuclear depth charges to us. In fact, they were doing so much damage to our submarine that the captain gave orders to arm the nuclear torpedo. We didn't know this, but each of those submarines had a nuclear torpedo on board for taking out the American fleet if need be. Fortunately, he was talked down and he did surface. The other major risk that I'll mention during the Cuban Missile Crisis that's not generally known is that the Joint Chiefs of Staff, all of them, wanted to attack the missiles with airstrikes and then invade Cuba to eliminate the communist cancer from the Western Hemisphere once and for all. Well, what they didn't know is that the Russians already had battlefield nuclear weapons on Cuba to repel just such an invasion. So if our troops had landed on Cuba, they probably would have been vaporized. Khrushchev knew about this. Well, you might say that was over 60 years ago, over 50 years, coming up on 60 years next year. But what about today? Nothing like that would happen today. Didn't we learn our lesson? Unfortunately not. In 2008, almost no one's aware of it, but there was a mini crisis that I call the 2008 Cuban bomber mini crisis. I'll give you just a quick summary. George W. Bush was president, and he was putting in place a missile defense system in Eastern Europe, which involved basing missiles, admittedly defensive missiles, in Poland. Well, the Russians didn't see this as defensive. They saw it as offensive, designed to negate their nuclear deterrent. And they were just up in arms over this, almost literally. And at some point, Izvestia, which is often kind of like the equivalent of the Washington Post used for leaks, official leaks, quoted an anonymous high Russian Air Force official who said, don't worry about those missiles in Poland to take out our ICBMs. We'll just hop over them. We'll base nuclear bombers on Cuba. Almost no one knows about this. However, some Senate staffer learned of it. And when General Norton Schwartz was in his confirmation hearings as Air Force Chief of Staff, he was asked about this. And he said what he had to say. He said, if they do that, it crosses a red line. Very dangerous. Because once you set a red line, if it's crossed, you have to do something or lose all credibility. I'll mention just a couple of other examples. There are unfortunately far too many to include in this talk. Taiwan is a potential flashpoint with China. We don't quite understand it. People in America tend to see China as meddling in Taiwan's internal affairs when China says, you better not declare de facto independence. By the way, that is one of the few things that could cause a war with China. And to understand it, think of our own civil war. Our civil war ended in 1865. The Chinese Civil War ended in 1948, but it really never ended because the nationalists retreated to Taiwan protected by America and have maintained this separate rebellious territory from the PRC's point of view. I'm not saying that's how we should view it, but that's how they view it. And you can see how strong the emotions are in the United States, in the South in particular, over the Civil War, where it's hard to take out a statue of Robert E. Lee. People get killed over things like that. So with the Chinese Civil War being much more recent, you can see where China may see Taiwan very differently from us. Now, I'm not proposing that we abandon Taiwan, but one thing we need to do is to stop encouraging talk of de facto independence. In 1994, I think it was, the president of Taiwan was a pro-independence politician, and he came to the United States and said things which he wasn't supposed to say that caused what's called the third Taiwan Straits crisis, and that we came close to war with China in that time. And we averted it because we had unquestioned military superiority, and we forced the Chinese to back down. But they've smarted under that, and their aggressive behavior in the South China Sea is partly, not solely, but partly attributable to the humiliation they faced. Never again, which the Jews on this call will remember as an expression, is not only a Jewish expression, it's a Chinese expression, although they don't quite use those words. North Korea is another good one to talk about. And this is good to mention because most of you, as myself, I assume did not like the Trump presidency for many reasons, found much fault with it. However, one thing Trump did that was better than even Obama was he got the North Koreans to stop doing nuclear tests. Now you might say, what are you talking about? I mean, he got nothing out of the summits with the North Koreans, because that's what the New York Times says. But there's not been one North Korean nuclear test, a long-range missile test, since the Singapore summit. Now that's likely to change because they're not getting anything in return. But Trump actually deserves some credit there. Now he muffed it later, but I won't go into that. But this does point out a problem. If that was news to you, it's a sign that the American mentality and the American media is not covering international affairs the way they should. Another example is Russia and Ukraine. Now, it's very complicated, and I won't go into details, but the situation is more complex than the Russians make out, where they make out like the Ukrainian government now is a bunch of neo-Nazis, and the Americans make out like the Ukrainian government is a bunch of wonderful people. There are some neo-Nazis in the Ukrainian government, and as those of you old enough to remember the Holocaust or the history of the Holocaust will remember, Ukrainians, some of them were involved in perpetrating the Holocaust. So it's very tricky. And but what I will tell you here is Timothy Morrison, and at the first impeachment hearing, he was a former senior director for Europe and Russia at the National Security Council. This is a direct quote. The United States aids Ukraine and her people so that they can fight Russia over there, and we don't have to fight Russia here. That was quoted by Adam Schiff, by the way, soon afterward, which I violently disagree with this. Those of you who remember Vietnam, remember the domino theory? Well, that was we have to fight the communists over there so we don't fight them over here. And George W. Bush said almost the same thing about terrorism. So this is the third time I'm hearing we have to fight them over here, there so we don't fight them over here. It deserves more, a deeper research, deeper thinking than just going with the phrase. What Bush said in, I think it was 2004, we will fight the terrorists over there so we do not have to face them in the United States of America. So we need to really question the Ukrainian situation. Well, cybersecurity, which is my original area of research, my original area of contribution, and the one for which I won the Turing Award, which the plaque behind me over there is the Turing Award, the top prize in computer science. Cybersecurity, it's a little ironic, as Julie pointed out in her introduction, that I left cybersecurity to work on nuclear security, international security, when cybersecurity now is assuming potentially existential dimensions. But even though cybersecurity is not yet to that point, it's creating additional sparks that could set off the nuclear tinderbox. And that's because we have a nuclear taboo. There's a taboo against using nuclear weapons, but we have almost a love affair with cyber weapons, as the use of Stuxnet against the Iranians shows. This points out an important point. We need to treat the nuclear threat as a system problem within the mentality of war, not just a problem all by itself. The solution is not to just get rid of nuclear weapons, but to greatly reduce the mentality of war, to re-examine our thinking that leads to wars and see how much of it is really still valid. Then reducing and possibly eliminating the nuclear weapons will follow. We can't get rid of them until, there's no hope of getting rid of them until we reduce the incidence of war. That is the nuclear opportunity. And some of you may remember a group called Beyond War that was active in the 80s, and it was very active in the East Bay, and I actually worked in the East Bay with it. And here's a book, Breakthrough Emerging New Thinking, which came out in English in the United States and in Russian. That's why the Cyrillic proriv along the bottom. And I was the Western editor, Hellman, and Gromyko was the Soviet editor. This was not Anatoly Gromyko, but I'm sorry, this was not Andrei Gromyko, the foreign minister for life. It was his son, Anatoly Andreevich Gromyko, who was the Soviet editor. This came out after Gorbachev had lifted censorship. We couldn't have written that book before he did. And it got wonderful reviews from a former director of the CIA, William Colby, who called it an impressive and immensely valuable product. Isaac Asimov, Mary Louise Smith. I wish the Republican Party was still this way. She was a national chairman of the Republican Party in the 70s, I think. She called it the story of an extraordinary and exciting adventure and cooperation. So I mention this because some of you may know of Beyond War, and I worked intensively with that group in the 80s. It no longer exists, so I'm not recruiting. So now that I've covered the first step, which is how seeing that nuclear war is really a major threat, let me turn. So the first step was recognize that the risk of a major nuclear war is far greater than people realize. Let's turn to the second, believe that a solution is possible. Well, I know that a solution to the nuclear threat is possible because of the seemingly impossible changes that Dorothy and I have made in our marriage, in which she was the leader on. Disagreements that used to lead to fights and were leading to divorce, and that's not an exaggeration, are now opportunities to learn another perspective. And I'm going to give one quick example. About 7 years ago, we had two cars. One was 3 years old and the other was 6 years old. And I took the 6-year-old car into a service station locally for service. And the owner told me, if you ever want to sell that car, please tell me, because my wife would love it. So I come home and I tell Dorothy this story, but of course the car is only 6 years old. We at that time kept cars for at least 10 years and it was mechanically perfect, no reason to sell it that I could see. So imagine my surprise when a few days later, this woman, Dorothy, is looking at new cars. The only logic that I could see is that someone offered to buy our car, so she's looking at new cars. Makes no sense. So fortunately, this was within the last 20 years when we haven't had a fight. So I went to her and I said, Dorothy, I can't get over feeling that what you're doing is crazy, but I know you're not crazy. What am I missing? And she explained that the 3-year-old car had a backup camera and blind spot detection that the 6-year-old car did not have. And with our advancing age, and particularly some meds that she's on that make her a little more hesitant driving, she said that made her much more comfortable. And the new car she was looking at had even more safety features. All of a sudden, what had been a crazy idea became a brilliant idea, not just for Dorothy, but for me. I appreciate those safety features as well. So that's an example of something that before I would have gotten mad at her about, and it's explained more in our book, because I brought baggage to the relationship. We didn't have much money growing up. My father was a high school teacher. And if my mother ever wanted something and my father couldn't provide the money for it, because that's how it was done in those days, then he was in the doghouse. And so it was very threatening to me for Dorothy to be looking at anything, even if she didn't want to buy it. I could dream about motor gliders and eventually buy one when we had the money for it. But I could dream about it even when we didn't, but she was not allowed to do things like that. And you can see I got over that. And so that's an example of how we need to change internationally as well. We need to ask more questions. So as one example, we quote in the book Hillary Clinton, and there are endnotes that back all of this up, as saying it's just despicable that the Russians would not allow, when she was Secretary of State, this was, it's just despicable that the Russians would not allow a UN Security Council resolution condemning the violence in Syria. Well, if Hillary had asked more questions, she would have found the answer. We then quote a speech by Medvedev, who was the president of Russia at the time, in which he says, of course, what happened in Libya is affecting our position with respect to Syria. We allowed Security Council resolutions condemning the violence. We were assured there would not be any military action. And then look what the West did. They created this chaos over there. They got the guy murdered. They interfered in the internal affairs of Libya. We're not going to let that happen again. I'll tell you one other story, and this is a fun one because it involves an admiral who did an amazing thing. It's Admiral Bobby Endman. He was director of NSA and back in the late 70s when I was doing my work in cryptography. And more than loosely speaking, NSA wanted to throw me in jail for publishing my papers because they felt I was violating security restrictions, even though I had no access to classified information in this area. In 1978, several years into this conflict, this war really that I was having with NSA, and by the way, my mother called me up and said, what the hell are you doing? You're going to get yourself killed. Because it wasn't just NSA I was pissing off, it was their foreign equivalents. I get a call from the National Security Agency Director's Office saying that Admiral Endman's going to be in California. He'd like to meet with me if I'm willing. I jumped at the opportunity, and we had initially a very cautious relationship, but now we are good friends. He has signed 2 statements of support for projects of mine, including Rethinking National Security that I'll talk about later. Another example of seemingly impossible changes occurring, and it's seemingly impossible that NSA and I could make peace, but we did. Imagine if in 1983 or even January 1984 or even January 1985, 3 months before Gorbachev came to power, someone had told you that the Soviet Union and the Cold War would come to an end by a man coming to power as the chairman of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, who would lift censorship, encourage free debate, and not use force when the Soviet Union broke up. I would have said that was crazy. And yet that's what happened. And so they didn't know it was impossible, so they did it. Keep that in mind. So at this point, I think we know there's a huge problem, the nuclear threat. That's the first step. But is a solution possible? What can you as a single individual do to affect such a huge problem? Well, this is actually we're now into the third step, the role that you can play. One of my key mentors in this area was a professor of business law at Stanford, whose name was Harry Rathbun. Now, Harry died in the 1980s. He was born in the 1890s. Sandra Day O'Connor, among others, credits Harry with being the key influence in her life. And here's what she said in a 2004 interview. This is Sandra Day O'Connor. He, Harry Rathbun, was the first person ever to speak in my presence of how an individual could make a difference, even in our huge world, how a single caring person can effectively help determine the course of events. I hadn't heard that before, really, and he put it forward in such a persuasive way that we could make a difference, end of quote. Well, 6 years later, I'm working on the Stanford campus trying to mobilize Stanford students. And because Harry had played such a key role in Sandra Day O'Connor's life and mine both, she was willing to write a letter that encouraging the students to participate, in which she said, I can now say unequivocally that he was right, that a single individual can make such a difference. Well, the other thing you can do, so what can you do to make a difference? One is you can read our book, and you're probably doing some of it already, but there was a lot that I had to learn. I imagine there's something that all of us can learn, because I can't point to one nuclear weapon that I've eliminated. But I can tell you that my life is a hell of a lot better now, not fighting with my wife, than it was 40 years ago when we were on the verge of divorce. And there's a section in the book called Where the Personal and Global Meet that I strongly encourage you to read. I don't have time to go into the details. Well, let me, in the remaining few minutes, because I want to close and have lots of time for questions, give a specific action that I hope you will consider undertaking. You've all heard write a letter to your congressman, right? Well, you're tired of that, and so am I. But what if you could arrange a meeting with your member of Congress at their local office? That is a lot easier than you think. And I'd like to, if some of you are interested in trying to do this, they'll put up my email address on the chat. It's hellman@stanford.edu. If some of you are interested, please email me and let me know, and we'll talk about what you can do. I'll give you the rough idea right now. By the way, it's important that you arrange the meeting at the local office. That way you don't have to travel to Washington, which is tricky this time in the COVID era. But also, if you get 15 minutes with a congressman or a congresswoman, that's a lot in DC. They're constantly being called away for votes. When I meet with Anna Eshoo, my congresswoman here, with J Street, for example, which some of you know about, we often get an hour with her. We're supposed to only have half an hour, but she lets it run over. She likes the meeting so much. And what you do is you get together a small group of people. You start with a mayor or a city councilman, city councilwoman, and someone who hopefully knows the member of Congress, and you work your way up. It could take a few months to do, but it can happen. I'll tell you, they're very interested in talking with people. And what do you want to talk with your member of Congress about? Rethinking national security. Asking more questions rather than getting ourselves in an uproar. Bringing it into our defense planning. Well, what is rethinking national security? Again, there's a link that I think can be put up to my homepage for Rethinking National Security. It's on my Stanford website. The first important thing to know is that a statement of support has been signed not only by Admiral Bobby Inman, the former director of NSA, a retired 4-star admiral, but by Leon Panetta, the Secretary of Defense under Obama, forgive me. I'm thinking of Bill Perry. And so a statement of support has been signed by Leon Panetta, Admiral Bobby Inman, former chairman of the National Intelligence Council, as well as John Hennessy, Stanford's last president, and a number of Nobel laureates. So what's the basic idea behind rethinking national security? There's a very short statement, 154 words, that summarizes it, and then there's a longer report that goes into more detail. Here's the basic idea. In 1945, when World War II ended, the United States was totally secure. No one could attack us. Today, after spending trillions upon trillions upon trillions of dollars to improve our national security, we can be destroyed in under an hour. Their statement doesn't say what the hell went wrong, but I'll say it here. What the hell went wrong? You spend all that money and you go from being totally secure to totally insecure. The statement then asks, in this age of nuclear weapons, pandemics, cyber attacks, terrorism, and environmental crises, including global warming, is national security becoming inseparable from global security? If so, how do our current policies need to change? Those are questions that more Americans and more members of Congress need to be asking. And so if you get a meeting with your member of Congress, you can bring that statement. You can show them Leon Panetta has signed it and all the other people. And you can then ask your representative to bring this up with the appropriate committees in the House. It would be the House Armed Services Committee, the Strategic Forces Subcommittee, both of which I've worked with. Maybe they're even on those committees. And if you want to do this, contact me. I'd be happy to talk more with you and even join you in a meeting if you can do that. Let me summarize with the 3 steps. 1, recognize that the risk of a major nuclear war is far greater than people realize. And also, step 2, believe that a solution is possible, both personally and internationally. And the last step is see the role that you can play and act accordingly, both in your personal life and in acting internationally, for example, meeting with your member of Congress, talking with your friends and neighbors. So with that, I will end and take questions.
That was the content of our flights.
So I have a question, Marty, and please, everybody, chat into the chat box if you have a question or a comment or thoughts. I mean, did this make you think? I remember, when we were in high school, we used to hide under desks. This is a considerably different approach to that, to keeping ourselves safe. What thoughts do you have to share with Marty? What does this remind you of? Does it remind you of any other action you've been asked to take? So I have a question, Marty. I imagine that a number of people on this call are pretty active already in a variety of things. And I'm just wondering, how do you give this the appropriate priority? We're being asked to think about climate change because of our grandchildren and the fact that the planet's going to be gone. And then maybe, we're not going to have to worry about nuclear war. People are starving to death. The virus is, continuing to spread. There are a whole manner of other things I guess we could list that would concern people. So where do you put this in terms of priority? With other things, and what do you say to people about how to bump it up?
Okay, well, first of all, good question, Julie. And that points out I focused on the nuclear threat when I really should be focusing on national security. It's called Rethink. The project is called Rethinking National Security, not Rethinking Our Nuclear Posture. Nuclear weapons are the motivator, the initial motivator, but the pandemic is in this statement. Global environmental crises are in the statement. All of it's really the same. What we have to do is stop going with our gut and start becoming more conscious. What I said, and by the way, there's a link that people can find. It's on my publications page, which is easily accessible by Googling Hellman Stanford Publications. I gave a talk 2 years ago to the annual meeting of Nobel laureates. I was honored to address them on the technological imperative for ethical evolution. And the point I made is that the problem is not really nuclear weapons. It's not really climate change. It's not pandemics, which we didn't yet have. Most people weren't thinking about. The fundamental problem is the chasm between our godlike physical power that technology has given us and our at best irresponsible adolescent behavior as a species. So nuclear power falls into that same realm. Whether you're for or against nuclear power, no one wants irresponsible 16-year-olds running a nuclear power plant, right? And yet, that's effectively what we have. When Fukushima blew, fortunately, the manager was not an irresponsible 16-year-old, but the managers in TEPCO in Tokyo told him not to flood the plant with seawater. They were still trying to save it. He knew it was toast. He flooded it with seawater, preventing a worse disaster. Very un-Japanese of him to disobey orders. And so what we need is to grow up. What I say is humanity is like a 16-year-old kid with a new driver's license who somehow gets his hands, and it's his hands because it's typically a boy, on a 500 horsepower Ferrari. We're either going to grow up really fast or we're going to kill ourselves. And so the fundamental problem is the same. We need to start thinking things through. We need to start looking at the data, looking at the evidence, and behaving responsibly. And if we grow up in one area, then carry that over to all of them.
Okay, now we have somebody who made a suggestion, and I don't know if you know about a movie, but I'm just wondering whether there are other movies or books or other things that might focus on this issue. They say, see the movie, The Man Who Saved the World.
Oh, Arkhipov. Oh, is that about Arkhipov or forget there are two Russians that are often called the men who saved the world. Arkhipov was the officer on the nuclear submarine I described, he didn't give the order to arm the sub. He was the one who talked down the captain. Savitsky was the captain. The other guy who saved the world, or sometimes it's said that was Petrov is his name. In 1983, if I remember, a false alarm on the Soviet air defenses showed a massive American attack. I'm sorry, it showed an American ICBM attack, and he chalked it up to a false alarm disobeying orders to pass it up the chain of the chain of command. Good movies. Other movies I'd suggest are Dr. Strangelove. is still amazingly, unfortunately, appropriate. And a colleague of mine who is one of the premier, if not the premier historian of the nuclear age, Bart Bernstein, calls it a documentary because so much of it is true. It was true then and it's still true now. For example, the American general who starts World War III in Dr. Strangelove, the American president says, but I thought I was the only one who could authorize a nuclear strike. The George C. Scott character says, yes, Mr. President, you're the only one with the authority. And I hate to jump to conclusions, but it looks like General Ripper has exceeded his authority, making the case that there's a difference between the authority to start a nuclear war and the ability to start a nuclear war. The ability, as explained in Strangelove and still true today, has to devolve to lower levels in the chain of command, or all the Ruskies have to do, according to George C. Scott in the Strangelove, is kill you, Mr. President, and then they can attack us with impunity. So there's got to be devolution of authority.
Okay, so we have two questions here.
One other thing, there's a book, 2034. One of the co-authors is Admiral Stavridis, and it's about how the Third World War starts in 2034 with China, by the way, not Russia. Highly recommend it.
Okay, so we have a couple of comments and questions related to the action item that you suggested. So first, here's one. Mark says, with a great deal of effort, I can and have met with a small group with congressional and state officials. But I find that the lobbyists for the military strategists and corporate profiteers have been meeting almost daily with these same leaders. How can we counter their vested interest in maintaining a militaristic foreign policy? That's a great question. And the other one is sort of a more general one, which is how to plan the meeting with a congressman and how long to explain concerns versus how many questions to ask, etc.
So let me do the first one first, and then I may have to ask you to repeat the second one. So let me do the first one first.
Yeah, the second one is very practical about how to actually get the meeting and how long to allow. The other one is a broader view of it.
It's true that the military-industrial complex, to use Dwight Eisenhower's words, has tremendous impact on Congress. However, the people who, congressmen and congresswomen, pay a lot of attention to constituents because each letter, I think they see is like 100 or 1,000 votes. Each meeting, they'll see even more. And so I'm not saying that your meeting by itself will solve the problem, just like my doing what I'm doing by myself will not solve the problem. But it's a cumulative effect of many such actions. And if you are successful in getting a meeting, then another thing you can do is talk to friends in other congressional districts to do the same thing. And we can start to snowball. You might get other people in the same congressional district. So there's a second or a third meeting with your representative. By the way, I can't guarantee that we'll have success. I can guarantee the following, though. If we don't try, we will fail. And so the way Harry Rathman, my mentor in this area, used to put it, he said, there are two hypotheses. The nobler hypothesis, the better hypothesis, is that we're capable of the radical changes required by these technological changes. The less noble hypothesis is that we're doomed. And I have to admit that often it seems like we're doomed. But if we accept the less noble hypothesis, Harry went on, we are doomed even if we had the capacity for change because we won't be motivated, we won't try. But if we assume the noble hypothesis, the worst that happens is we go down fighting. And the best that happens is we cheat the Grim Reaper where it seems like we had no real chance of doing so. And he then said with a twinkle in his eye, why not assume the nobler hypothesis? And by the way, I ended my talk to the Nobel laureates with that story. So that's
very inspiring. Let me so this is part of that question, but it also goes to the other one, which is more practical about how to plan the meeting. So probably 40 years ago, I was working for a Native American organization, and we were meeting with local congressmen to convince them to put money in the budget for something. I don't remember what it was. But it was some health related thing. And we walked in, you've got a nice local person, Anna Eshu, right? So do most of us. We live in California, in Northern California. So we were meeting with Bomber Bob, I forget his name. Bob, he was a congressman, and he had literally hanging from the ceilings. He had replicas of bombers, which were no doubt, given to him by the lobbyists. So he barely listened to us, seriously. And it was pretty difficult to maintain a civil tone with him because he was, excuse me, but such an asshole. So, what's the value of meeting with somebody like Anna Eshoo, who is already probably, on your side?
Good question. A friend of mine was in Washington, D.C. about 10 years ago, meeting with the chief lobbyist for the Friends Committee on National Legislation, who since has passed away, who understood D.C. inside out. And my friend said, our whole congressional delegation is on board. It was Barbara Boxer in those days, Dianne Feinstein and Anna Eshoo. And this guy said, David Culp was his name. David said, oh, you get it all wrong. Lobbying Dianne Feinstein is particularly important. She has limited political capital and she decides where to spend it. And she decides based partly on what her constituents want. If this issue is moved up in her priority queue, she will spend more time. And she has credibility on both sides of the aisle the way Barbara Boxer did not. And so the other thing is there's something called an S-curve. This came about in business. When there's adoption of a new product, a new idea, Everett Rogers was the person who first, he's since passed away, noticed this and wrote it up and became famous for it. His father was a corn farmer, if I remember, in Nebraska or Iowa, and new drought-resistant, pest-resistant strains of corn came out, but very few farmers adopted them. Anyway, eventually, when the Dust Bowl hit, they adopted them all over the place. And what he saw is that there are he defined 5 segments to this S-curve. It's the adoption of a new idea. It starts off very slow, seeming like you're getting nowhere, and then it goes up very rapidly, and then it tails off. And the first phase are what he called the innovators. And he said the innovators are rarely the leaders of society, like the political leaders, because if they adopt a radically new idea, no matter how correct it is, they'll be voted out of office. Think of someone who said slavery is inhuman in 1850 and was a congressman, wouldn't get reelected. The next group is, but the innovators serve a useful purpose. They take the idea from 0% to about 2 or 3% of the population. At that point, the early adopters, who might be members of Congress like Anna Eshoo, not Bomber Bob, can start to get on board. And it moves up the curve. We're herd animals, and we believe what people around us believe. It's important to get this going socially. And the last group, by the way, he called the laggards. I wish he'd used a less negative term, but you might remember the rancher, what was his name, who wouldn't pay grazing fees to the federal government, right. And he got armed militiamen to come out and protect him from the feds. Well, he was the darling of Fox News until he started musing about slavery. And he said something like this, were those blacks better under slavery when they had a family life and cohesion? Or are they better off today, and overlooking that they were sold off and families were sold off, or are they better off today on welfare? Well, all of a sudden, Hannity dropped him like a hot potato. And so Bomber Bob may have been one of the laggards, and I don't know that it pays to talk to them, but it doesn't hurt, because what do you have to lose? And if that's your congressman. But I would really focus on the other group.
Okay, so the meeting, the person who asked the meeting about the question about how to plan the meeting, remember that Marty did volunteer to actually talk with you directly. I imagine in some cases the strategy may be different depending on which committee the congressperson you want to talk to is on, or whatever. So you can contact him, and I heard this, but he did volunteer to go with you to the meeting. So
right, virtually or in person. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we have time for a couple more questions.
No, thank you, Julie. That's the answer I would have given.
Okay, good. All right, so I have one question here, and if you have a question or a comment, please chat it in, because we're going to start wrapping up. So here is the question: what, if any, debate regarding the ethics of developing nuclear weapons and the logically extended scenario of mutually ensured self-destruction, was involved in the planning and execution of the Manhattan Project.
Okay, important. I was actually just been talking with Bart Bernstein about whether Oppenheimer ever expressed regret over the use of the A-bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And it turns out he had very mild regret, if any. But it's important to remember, my father was in the Army in World War II. He was in the South Pacific, fortunately Hawaii, and they told him to get off the troop ship in Hawaii rather than Okinawa. My uncle was on a destroyer and had kamikazes attacking them. I mean, this was not a time when, actually, here's the simple answer. I used to wonder whether some Americans have argued that the use of the A-bomb was ethical, even moral, because we saved Japanese lives by using it. More Japanese would have died, they argue, I'm not agreeing with this, more Japanese would have died in an invasion of the home islands than in the A-bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I used to go back and forth on this, even if they were right, was it moral? And then I cut through the Gordian knot. What I realized is once you're in a war, morality is out the window. You win a war by killing more people than the other side faster than they do. And so the only time to make a moral decision is before the war starts, avoiding it. So for example, it would have been very moral in 1919 to have argued against the Treaty of Versailles, which wrongly blamed Germany solely for starting World War I and laid the foundation for Hitler. As Rudy has told me, your husband, Julie, his father, who was a member of the Nazi Party, unlike Rudy told me that for most people, the Third Reich ended in May 1945. It didn't end for him until he left his father's home.
He did say that.
And your book, Stumbling Stone, goes into some of this, which I highly recommend to people, by the way.
Thanks for the plug.
Yes. I started reading it when you sent me an advance copy. You sent me a copy, and I started reading it as a courtesy, but I couldn't put the book down. I finished it in one night. It was just so fascinating. But,
okay, so you heard what Marty said, though, which is the time to discuss the morality is before you start the war.
Right, and that's what we need to do now. Like, what I've said is we should stop getting into so many needless wars. A friend of mine who works in the peace movement, in fact, he was president of the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation at the time, said, why don't you just say we should stop getting into wars? And I said to him, David, what's the difference? They've all been needless. Except it's impossible to argue against we shouldn't get into needless wars, whereas people, if you say we shouldn't get into wars, people say you're a dreamer.
Well, that sounds like a good way to end, but if you have any last comments you want to make, this would be a good time before I turn it. We have a few important things to tell you, so don't leave. I'm going to turn it over to Sudhin unless Marty has some last thoughts.
The only last thought is thank you all. This has been a wonderful opportunity. And if some people are interested, I'd love to work with you. And so thank you.
That sounds like a great offer. Sudhin.
Great. Thank you so much, Marty and Julie. So quickly before we close out, as Avi had mentioned at the start, we are working to start reopening and doing some in-person events. And we have a very quick poll I would love for our attendees to participate in. So I'm going to launch it and it should come up on your screen. The question is, would you have decided to attend in person today if Martin had been giving his presentation in a meeting room in North Berkeley, which is where our office is? So you can go ahead and vote, very likely, somewhat likely, neutral, somewhat unlikely, very unlikely. This is all anonymous. And I'm just going to give a couple seconds. I can actually see the percentage of people who have voted. So
No,
we're
and
at
this
50%.
is really, I think it's worth saying this is very helpful because we are at a point where we're trying to decide how much virtual and how much real, live, whatever you want to call it, stuff we should do. So your input is really important.
Absolutely.
You might do a hybrid thing where people can come in person or attend virtually.
And we have a wonderful committee and team of technology volunteers who are looking into hybrid events for the future. And so we're trying to see what the interest is. We know it's a little bit different for everyone. So we're at 75%. Would love to get as close to 100 as possible. Panelists, have you voted? I think I enabled it so panelists can vote also. Great. I'll stop it when we get to 80. 80. Okay. So I'm going to end it I'll quickly share it. It's pretty split, which is really interesting and good to know. I think, again, it's going to be, we're in this quote unquote new normal. And so we're going to kind of see where things go, but this was really helpful. So I appreciate everyone participating, and feel free to send comments in the chat if you have other information or input. And I'm going to pass it over to, oh, Marty, you have something?
Yeah, 50% were unlikely if you had those two bottom numbers. It's a lot.
I think we're in this, this new age of a comfort with technology, and we've seen that accessibility is really enhanced with virtual and being online, not having to commute, being able to have closed captioning. So we're gonna carry that forward. And so thank you so much for that quickly, and I'm gonna pass it out to Marcia to close this out.
Thank you, Suyin, and thank you so much, Marty Hellman. This was a fascinating hour and a half, and it gave me so much to think about that I hadn't ever thought about before, really. And that doesn't happen very often. I think that probably many of us have that, and we'll certainly bring it up with our Elder Action social justice group and see whether or not we can begin to set up appointments with our members of Congress. And if so, you'll be hearing from us. I want to thank you all who participated in this for coming, and remind you that these events are free and that they will continue to be free, but running Ashby Village is not free, and we need your support. So if you are so inclined and would like to make a donation in honor of this event, in the Arts and Culture Series, the Science and Ideas Group, the work of Martin Hellman, please do so. The information that you need for that is in the chat box.